Morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Is that clear? No. Is that clear now that everyone is there? Yes. Great. So just one announcement that I was asked to make before we start is that everyone please make sure that their phone is on silent before we get going. I think that mine is. And I've put it far away so that we don't get any interference on the microphone. And then one further announcement, you'll notice that I'm here by myself today. Unfortunately, my colleague Henny, you would have seen the moon boot that was on yesterday, that is playing up quite severely, and he has to go. Was that? I don't know what that was. He has to go and see a doctor, and the doctor could only see him at 11 a.m. So unfortunately, I'm taking over his burden today. But we're going to see, because my prediction is that without Henny here, we will run better to time. So that will be the test to see if that is actually the case. So just reflecting, we finished up yesterday speaking a little bit about the United Kingdom. And yesterday we went on a bit of a roller coaster. We went through the countries very quickly. We spoke about China, the United States, the UK. And then in those stories, we spoke about Zaire, we spoke about Singapore. And just Henny and I were chatting about it afterwards, and also just saying, at a certain point, you can only take in so many names and characters and connections. And so just to kind of, I guess, draw back a little bit today, what my plan is, or what I've envisioned today, is to start off to answer your question, actually, sir, on the Security Council and the arms trade first, because I think it was a very good question, and I didn't have the figures offhand. And when I checked them last night, they are quite remarkable, and they tell quite an incredible tale about the global arms trade today. So just to start off with that, with some of those figures and what they tell us, and then to do what it says on the lecture schedule, which is to draw some of the continuities that we started looking at yesterday between apartheid-era sanctions busting and the 1999 arms deal. Beyond the French, to look at a few other characters who just come back, sort of reinvent themselves in different eras, to try and plot how the failure to hold people accountable in given eras has quite severe consequences down the road, all the way through to what we're really seeing today in state-owned enterprises and state capture. And that, of course, is a very good place to kind of end, because we're seeing around us, with the inquiries about SASA going on, the ESCOM hearings, all of these sort of public airings of these issues that are taking place right now. And then to end off on a positive note, because there's been a lot of doom and gloom when you're speaking about the global arms trade and apartheid collaborators, to speak a little bit about what Open Secrets is actually doing with this information that we found. I think one of the questions that everyone asks is, okay, well, what next? What can we do with this stuff? And to speak about what we do as an organization, but also what civil society is doing more broadly in trying to tackle these issues of economic crime. And then finally, what I will do, and I promise I will do it today, is leave more time for questions at the end in terms of the entire lecture series. So if there's something that has come up in the first 2 days that still doesn't quite make sense, or anything else related to today, maybe just give ourselves a little bit more time to talk through those things. So to start off with, when you look at the global arms trade and you double-check the figures, there's a couple of organizations who do great work in this regard. Amnesty International it does a huge amount to look at the data every year and track the movements and the changes in the global arms trade. And there's an organization based in Stockholm called SIPRI, S-I-P-R-I, and they have always been very good, dating back to the apartheid era and before, in gathering arms data. And you'll see in that first figure, it's pretty staggering. $1.7 trillion in 2016, the global arms trade was valued at. What I haven't written there, which is perhaps the more disturbing element, is that it's growing at a higher rate than any other, than any other area of global trade, or it is one of the highest growing areas. So that, I believe 2 or 3 years ago, was 1.2 trillion, and it's now 1.7 trillion. So it's a vast industry, and it's a growing industry. And to go to the question that was yesterday about the Security Council and how much the Security Council accounts for that, the United States and Russia account for more than 50% of the trade in terms of imports and exports. So around about $1 trillion a year in imports and exports out of the US and Russia. And the USA is also a large importer. If you look at the list, the 5 Security Council countries are in the top 6 global exporters of arms in the world, starting with the United States and Russia, and then followed by France, China, and the United Kingdom. The only other country that makes it into that top 6 is Germany. Unsurprising, because they've always been a large weapons provider, and it's actually one of the case studies that we'll look at now in terms of what was then West Germany and what has become Germany, has been a consistent supplier to apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa. And so I've got the statistics there. The Security Council, 75% of the arms trade, and if you add Germany, that's over 80%. The only other outside of that, those figures, the 2 countries really to take note of is India, which is the 2nd biggest arms importer currently, as a country that is starting to position itself geopolitically as more of a force. It is arming itself to the teeth. And obviously it has historical conflicts as well, in, of course, Kashmir and Pakistan being high up on that list. But this last point, and I don't know why I'm pointing because I have this thing to point, this is the one that I really want to pick up on. The largest single growth market in terms of buying weapons has been Saudi Arabia. And it's a conflict that we don't speak very often about, I think, in South Africa, is the conflict currently happening in Yemen. So the United States in 2016 sold $110 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. The United Kingdom sold about £5 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis have increased, I believe, again, the figure in 2016 was a 250% increase in their arms imports. And the predominant use for those weapons is in Yemen, bombing campaigns, and of course, for the United States. And as a disclaimer here, I'm not an expert on Middle Eastern policy. And so the deep intricacies of the conflict, I'm probably not qualified to speak about. But of course, the insurgency in Yemen is backed, or the rebels, as they are labeled in the media, are backed by Iran. And so for the United States, it's seen largely as a proxy battle against Iran in the region. And that's one of the reasons that the US and the UK are flooding weapons to Saudi Arabia to allow them to use them. Of course, the thing is, tens of thousands of people have been killed in Yemen, civilians, in that conflict. And just double-checking some of the figures, they now estimate, the United Nations now estimates that 1 million people have cholera in Yemen. Over 1 million people have been displaced, and they're seeing the resurgence of diseases like diphtheria and others that, of course, we generally tend to see as eradicated and no longer existing, diseases of bygone eras. But the breakdown of the society there because of the war is so severe that the United Nations are now calling Yemen the greatest, basically, human catastrophe that's happening right now. But of course, the figure that brings this all together is that the United Nations has just made what they've called the biggest donation in their memory of aid to Yemen to deal with the humanitarian crisis. It's $50 million US. The US sold them $110 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and the influx of aid, which is seen as vast, is $50 million. And so it does give you a little bit of a contemporary picture of the kind of conduct that the Security Council engages in, that those countries and their arms traders engage in, and the vast profits that can be extracted from the industry. And this is one of the primary challenges, because as long as that industry continues to generate those kind of profits, it will continue to have a large amount of power to lobby governments, and it will be able to use that influence. So that is the very gloomy picture of the global arms trade. And just to answer that question a little bit, to go And now, so to move back, so that was a little aside really just about those figures, but to move back to the story of apartheid, guns and money. One of the things that we set out to do was to plot the continuities between what we found about what was happening in the apartheid era and what is happening in South Africa today. And it's one of our biggest challenges, I think, as an organization like Open Secrets to do that. And one of the reasons that it's such a big challenge is that, and you are all likely politically engaged and aware of this, but these issues become so politicized so quickly when you talk about so-called apartheid corruption and so-called contemporary corruption. And there's a lot of people making a lot of noise that seeks to compare the eras to try and downplay one of the eras, right? So you will always find people who will go, no, we shouldn't talk about apartheid anymore, it's irrelevant. Look at what's happening at Eskom. It is the only thing that matters, right? And similarly, you've got organizations like Black First, Land First, who use the crimes of the past as in an attempt to shield people today from accountability for crimes. And so when you enter that political space, it is a challenge, right? Because you need to kind of position yourself so that your material is not used for nefarious agendas, number one, but also to add nuance to the debate, to make sure that what we find can be helpful, I guess, for that debate, to try and clarify why that false binary or dichotomy between apartheid corruption and now we have a new type of corruption is a problem. There are two examples that exemplify this. They're not the only examples, but they are kind of clear. The one is the story that Henny told us all yesterday. So I won't rehash that, but just to provide the sort of overarching point, Thompson CSF, which is one of apartheid South Africa's most important weapon suppliers of a range of parts for quite sophisticated weapons technology through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, is the same corporation not in name, but in structure and in terms of personnel, that is alleged to have bribed President Zuma in the post-apartheid arms deal, and to have paid off Zuma to avoid prosecution in South Africa should the prosecuting authorities want to pursue the case. So we have a clear case there of a continuity between the two eras. There's another quite interesting one in terms of countries, and we haven't had a chance to speak about this country, so it's also kind of opportune, is that West Germany has large industrial interests in South Africa. Some of its biggest corporations have industry here, and so they're always actively lobbying in the 1980s and have active connections with apartheid officials. In the early 1980s, the South African military identifies a need for submarines. And they go to the West Germans, and this is now at the highest level, and I'll tell you a little story about that now. But they go to the West Germans and they say, can you assist us with providing at least the submarine blueprints and submarine technology in order for us to be able to build them here? And they have a little bit of trouble at the beginning because for all of these countries, it's a little bit difficult to do business out in the open with the apartheid state, as we've described. So P.W. Botha goes to Germany and he meets with Helmut Kohl, who's then Chancellor in West Germany. And Helmut Kohl he really in this era exemplifies the kind of ways that heads of state dealt with apartheid. So Helmut Kohl had a couch in his office where he would sit with any world leader that visited and they'd have a photo opportunity. You know, the kind of classic PR that world leader visits kind of have. And when P.W. Botha came, Helmut Kohl insisted that the couch be removed because he did not want to be seen to be too cozy with P.W. Botha. So he wanted to make it difficult. So there was only a standing greeting. There was no couch sitting, right? Which in international politics, I suppose, the theater of it is quite important. But they then retire to a meeting. And P.W. Botha says, we're having a little bit of problem with the submarine blueprint plan. Can you help? And Helmut Kohl says, I'll take care of it personally. In fact, those are his words in a document we found in the Free State Archive. I will take care of it personally, and I will contact you. And what we know is that within 1 to 2 years of that plan is full steam ahead, because we've found archival documents that show that Botha and the South African Navy start to send emissaries to do the deal, essentially, and to chat through some of the technicalities. So we've got the political connection, and then you've got the South African Navy document of the team of Navy personnel who are going to West Germany to visit the corporation, so the discussion. And what comes up, a name comes up there. It's, at that point, I believe, a captain. I think that's his title, but it's Jeremy Mathers. And I don't know if that name rings any bells off the top of your head, but I'll explain why it's important. And at that point, he's an operator. He's not making political decisions, but he is fundamentally negotiating the technicalities of the deal, and of course meeting all of the corporations. That submarine deal, it is believed that the blueprints were moved and that some of the construction at least started, but the German Green Party got wind of it, blew it open in Germany. The media made a huge fuss about it, and it made it very difficult, and ultimately the timing was such as well that as they moved into the 1990s, the large part of that project was scrapped. But the post-1999 arms deal comes around, and which companies are being engaged to look at some of the seacraft and the submarines? Ferrostaal, German company corporation that has absorbed, I don't want to actually put out the acronyms, but it's 2 German companies who were involved in the first deal, who are now form part of Ferrostaal, and they are doing the deal, essentially in post-1999. In the fallout that follows the arms deal, Ferrostaal itself, the corporation, asks a law firm to do a bit of due diligence about whether they paid any bribes, right? All of these reports will always come out and say that money was paid to people to facilitate the easy transaction of business, right? This is the kind of language that is used. And one of the people who stands accused of receiving that money to make sure that South African politicians would acquiesce to the German companies is Jeremy Mathers, the same person who was flying to Germany 1983, 1984. And so what it talks about, I mean, that whether he's involved in corruption, unfortunately, those things have never been tested in an open court. Hopefully they will be, right? We hope that all the allegations around Jacob Zuma and the French companies will be tested in court. But it's a wonderful example about how apartheid-era operators were not disadvantaged by the transition. In fact, they brought contacts with them that made the process a lot easier. But because if you want to engage in deals with those companies for a post-apartheid elite, you need to be able to get in the door. And who better to help get you in the door than someone who has been making these deals possible for decades, right? It's the experience that assists you. So that's one example. We've got the German companies, the French companies. Another person who is said to have been a key facilitator, middleman between the ANC and the European arms companies in the 1990s is someone by the name of Tony Georgiadis, which is a name that has come up a little bit more in the media. I don't know, by show of hands, how many people is that name kind of familiar with at all? Yeah, there's like kind of a few hands. Tony Georgiadis owns a Greek shipping company. He and his family own it in the late 1980s. And he's identified by the anti-apartheid movement as being one of the key shippers for oil in contravention of the embargo into South Africa. He provides the ships. And so he's deeply enmeshed in the apartheid elite. The story that the personal story that makes him famous, of course, is that he used to host F.W. de Klerk on his yacht around the Greek islands in the early 1990s. And what ended up happening was that Georgiadis' wife eventually left him and, of course, married de Klerk. So that story, yeah. And so, of course, that kind of story, it's popular because it kind of, there's a bit of color to it. But ultimately, he's providing ships to bust an embargo to help oil the apartheid state. And he's making vast amounts of money out of it, as a lot of these middlemen did. But again, that is someone who in the early 1990s identifies the fact that he is going to be able to continue his work if he can transition between the elites. And so in the early 1990s, he has property in Cape Town, and what starts to happen is the guest list to the parties start to change. So ANC officials are coming back, and suddenly the relationship with them are starting to be found. And again, allegedly, Georgiadis is one of the people who receives bribe money from the European arms companies in order to facilitate the deal. It, of course, doesn't stop there in terms of his connections, because these presidential visits overseas when they sort of, the president goes over and says, I'm going to ensure that business is friendly to South Africa. So Jacob Zuma did one of those visits, and I can't remember the exact year, but if you look at the list of a local businessman that he took with him, at one of those, Tony Georgiadis was still on that list. So that's someone who over decades is able to sort of enmesh themselves into the elite. I said that I wouldn't give too many names, but just the one kind of final example that I want to give is someone by the name of Fana Hlongwane. Now, Fana Hlongwane is someone who has faced a range of accusations, again never tested in court. And Menzi Simelane, when Menzi Simelane was head of the prosecuting authority, quite famously told the prosecutors just one day, the prosecutors came into work and he was like, this is not going to happen. There'll be no prosecution here. Now, Fana Hlongwane is identified by the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom as allegedly receiving money from BAE to facilitate, again, connections with ANC politicians during the arms deal. But just to draw that link forward, we know now, according to the Sunday Times, that when Mcebisi Jonas was taken to the Gupta compound, who organized the meeting? It was Fana Hlongwane. And to add to that, the now infamous story of Bell Pottinger and their relationship with the Guptas. It is alleged that Fana Hlongwane made that introduction because he knew the Bell Pottinger people through his old connections at BAE. And that made it possible for him to make those kinds of introductions. Now, someone like Fana Hlongwane is a middleman making his business work in a much broader context, right? And if we go back to the first figure that I gave at the top there, we must understand that all of these players are playing out in a nearly $2 trillion industry, right, every year. But on a local level for South African politics, what has occurred essentially is that, and one could argue that it's an early form of state capture, essentially, is that you have very wealthy European arms companies who have made an absolute mint out of arming the apartheid state to the teeth during the sanctions period in contravention of the embargo, moving in to bribe or attempt to bribe South African politicians in the 1990s. And who's drawing the connections and who's facilitating this? Well, they are people that are able to span both eras. Whether it's someone like Tony Georgiadis, Fana Hlongwane, John Bredenkamp, who we spoke about the other day, all of these characters. And of course, that's leaving aside all of the arms companies that remain the same over that period as well. I think that the last thing I'll say on this topic of the continuities, and this is an argument that we make, and I'm now just going to put up our logo just so that you're aware also where all of this stuff is. And if anyone thinks that I'm making up stories, because some of it's a little bit crazy, you can follow us at these addresses at the bottom in terms of websites, etc. But our argument at Open Secrets has also been that the ability of networks to morph across time, like I've described, and to be able to facilitate deals in each era, it stems from a fundamental failure to hold actors accountable at any one time in our history for the activities that they've engaged in. And so I think one of the arguments that was the starting point in terms of a missed opportunity is, why did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gloss over all of these economic crimes if they were so fundamental? Now, we would need hours to discuss the nature of South Africa's political transition and the horse trading and the need on the side of the ANC to appease, where they appeased too much, where both sides of the negotiating table gave up stuff and where they didn't. But I think what we do see is we see massive pressure from private sector actors at the time of the transition not to go looking at economic crime and not to unravel it, right? We can talk about violence and we can talk about people like Eugene de Kock, but we can't talk about Thales and Thomson CSF as a company, because that is about big business and it touches many, many people. And to use potentially the German example, one of the reasons it is so difficult for states to make that decision, if you look at Ferrostal, if you go back far enough, their own chancellor okayed the deal, right? The records show that Helmut Kohl said, we'll do it, it's fine. And that is a potential diplomatic bomb, essentially, right? We are convinced it's one of the reasons that the ANC state today won't release records, because the potential diplomatic fallout of exposing some of these links is so vast. I should say at this point that this is not a, what's the right word? Excuse. This is not to explain away the failure to hold actors accountable. I think we should criticize officials for not acting on some of these things, but it's just to put in context why some of it has been so difficult. But what we see is that, let's take the TRC as a starting point, the failure to grapple with these networks, therefore the failure to hold anyone accountable. Very, very quickly, the arms companies are back in, they're paying bribes, and they're engaged in what many would see as the fundamental starting point of some of the issues of economic crime today. Because President Zuma's charges, the 783 charges, they relate directly to the arms deal, right? The destruction of the Scorpions is related directly to the arms deal, right? The consistent changing of our National Director of Public Prosecutions, all of these things are attempts by the powerful to erode institutional capacity to look at these kinds of crimes. If you look at National Director of Public Prosecutions, I think we've had 8 in the last 14 years. Not one, after Bulelani Nkuka, not one has stayed for longer than 3 years. And of course, with the recent case, we know that the court has found that Nkosana was essentially pressured into taking the money so that he could get out, right? So that the appointments of Sean Abrams could be made. What that means is that it is incredibly difficult for our institutions to pursue politically sensitive cases. And so what happens is that they fall by the wayside. The difficulty and the argument that we at Open Secrets make is that you can't, or we should not as South Africans, allow a Stalingrad strategy like President Zuma engages in, which is basically, I'm going to delay this for as far as possible until you no longer really have any appetite to hold me accountable. And we've already seen some of it towards the end of last year when people were speaking about the president and what was going to happen. Did anyone start to see articles coming out about, oh, maybe we should just offer an amnesty, you know? Any deal to get him out because he's the problem. And once we have a new leader, everything will fix itself. And what we would argue is that that is hugely dangerous, because apartheid-era collaborators received a mass amnesty, particularly as it relates to economic crime, right? There was just no accountability whatsoever. Even when those actors were supporting a regime that was committing a crime against humanity, right? We're talking about, in that era, more than corruption. We're talking about willing complicity with the regime. But not one of those actors has been held accountable. And it freed them up to make hay in the 1990s. And that moment has had such catastrophic consequences for today. Because I think that we could argue that one of the reasons anyway, and it's not the sole reason, but one of the reasons that the Guptas were able to get their teeth into President Zuma in such a deep way is that he was looking for allies, because he needed to play the long game to avoid this accountability, right? And so he was securing his future in that way. And that's part of the reason that we've had these consequences. I think one of the major questions that remains about what's happening today is, how do we make this moment apparently of institutional change a more permanent one? Because I think the exciting thing is that what we've seen, for example, with the asset forfeiture units, is that those units are staffed with people who want to do their jobs, right? There's people in the asset forfeiture unit who have wanted to move on Gupta businesses for a very long time. The NPA has cases ready related to the 1999 arms deal. And there are prosecutors who want to do their work, but they've been prevented from doing so by political interference in institutions such as the Scorpions and the NPA. And I think the worry is essentially is that, how do we ensure that this is not just a moment of out with the old, in with the new, in terms of we now have a change in leadership, therefore we will have new deployees and we'll have a different sort of political alignment, to one where we can actually more broadly protect those institutions from interference at all. You know, can we get a public prosecutor that actually stays for his 10-year term and does not face political interference, and is not threatened with his job when he wants to go after apartheid-era criminals or the 1999 arms deal or anything else? And so, just to finish, because I'm going to open up for questions in about 5 or 10 minutes, but just to say what Open Secrets is doing as one of many organizations in this kind of economic crime space. Our first port of call as an organization is to try and hold the entities that we have identified in apartheid guns and money, so Kredietbank Luxembourg, the bank we told you about on the first day, and potentially some of the arms companies such as Thompson CSF or others, to hold them accountable for their role during apartheid. And we think that I think it's important for several reasons. The one is the arguments I've just made about, people say that justice delayed is justice denied. That's no doubt true for victims of crimes. But the risk that we run when we allow actors, if they can avoid accountability for enough time, just to forget about them, is hugely problematic, right? So the 1999 arms deal is now 19 years ago, right? At what point is there a 20-year mark at which people, we start going, well, that's old news? Because if you entrench that kind of system, you allow people to avoid justice simply by stringing it out, right? That becomes the strategy. So that's the first reason, is that I think that those banks and those arms companies that engaged in that conduct should be held accountable. There's a couple of other reasons. The one is that, and this is something that we're relying on in various places, is that, and I've mentioned this before, because apartheid was a crime against humanity, there's a real argument to be made that these were not just financial crimes, but that these were this was complicity or even aiding and abetting the broader crimes of apartheid. The bank Kredietbank Luxembourg, and I'm not sure we gave you this figure, but it is alleged by the previous Arms Corps officials that that bank moved at one point 70% of Arms Corps' money to buy weapons. And the apartheid state would not have survived for as long as it did unless there was an active willingness on the part of those institutions to move the money and to give them the arms. And so we're trying to make that argument in various places. Potentially in South Africa, if we can, that will be difficult. There are a whole range of issues around that, but we are looking at trying to do it through South African courts. Also because South African courts offer the best opportunity for victims to hold those institutions account. And I think we'd all agree that the number one goal although this will be the most difficult thing to do, would be to find restitution for those crimes. I think that those banks and arms companies, to use the popular phrase, should be forced to pay back the money, if they in any way can, even though that will be very difficult. The second thing that we're doing is we're trying to take that to Europe. One of the things that we found so difficult in our work is to get the European countries that were complicit in this to have a discussion about their own complicity, right? Now, this is something we see throughout Europe in particular. There are fascinating discussions, for example, in the United Kingdom, about how any stories of their colonial past are actually actively being withdrawn from curricula to avoid that discussion being had by young people in those countries. But we think it's important in places like Belgium and Luxembourg for those countries to start having a look at their institutions and how they acted in that period, and their failure to really hold those institutions to account. And so colleagues and I at Open Secrets are looking at possible avenues through the OECD. They have a process for civil society complaints to force at least one or two jurisdictions in the OECD to consider the bank's conduct and to potentially make a finding against the bank. And that would not be binding, but it would be an opportunity for greater advocacy in those spaces. And I guess to go back to what we were talking about earlier, it's those countries that need to have active movements to hold their governments to account. South Africans are not going to be able to stop the United States selling $110 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Only Americans will be able to do that. And so it's about trying to take the fight to those spaces to get discussions happening in that regard. And then the final thing that we're going to do is, that has just about fit on, is our argument has always been, if the state is not going to move on something, it's possible for civil society to move on something. It's possible for the public to move on things. And so what we, with a range of organizations, including the Right to Know campaign, the Foundation for Human Rights, Corruption Watch in Johannesburg is also involved, are assisting us with organizing the People's Tribunal on Economic Crime, which, much to our colleagues' kind of terror, is now happening in 10 days' time, from the 3rd to the 7th of February at Constitutional Hill in Johannesburg. And the idea behind this is actually what we've discussed over the last 3 lectures, the continuities between these. We're having public forums with a panel of 6 adjudicators that include previous Constitutional Court judges, activists from social movements from all over the country, trade unionists, lawyers, sort of people with a wide range of background that will be able to sort of look at the different elements of this. And they will hear evidence over the 5 days about apartheid-era sanctions busting and complicity with that regime, the evidence of corruption that is in the public about the 1999 arms deal, and allegations of state capture around state-owned enterprises and Denel. There's a massive discussion right now around the Zondo Commission and President Zuma releasing the terms of reference about what the State Capture Commission is going to look at. I think that we would argue that extending the terms of that commission to look at everything would probably be problematic, because given the time frames, it maybe wouldn't be possible for a commission of inquiry to look at all of those. We would argue very powerfully that there should be a similar kind of commission of inquiry into this kind of material on the apartheid era. But the joy of what we can do is that we are not bound by the rules of state, and we are not bound by the laws of evidence and the exact judicial procedure. And so we can have these kinds of public meetings. The public has been invited so that people can speak. Social movements and civil society organizations are going to be speaking about the consequences of the kind of high-level state capture for more fundamental things in South Africa around inequality and social justice. We're going to be speaking about more the nitty-gritty and the evidence. And that will be released in a report that will be distributed free to the public for further discussions on these issues. The first hearings will be focused on the arms trade in particular, simply because I think it's a great place to start in terms of drawing the continuities. But we're hoping anyway, if the first one is a success, which we really hope it will be, that this could be a model to use for other issues, other types of economic crime, and that could be anything. If you look at the Eskom issue, there's definitely a long tail from the apartheid era sanctions times to now, in terms of the conduct of oil traders, the Strategic Fuel Fund and what that institution was like, Eskom across time. And of course, there's a range of other issues. Corporate price fixing is ripe to be discussed in a people's tribunal of this nature. If we think back to the bread price fixing scandal, issues like that. Something that came up last year that has disappeared off our radar is the alleged forex manipulation by South African and international banks. That is something that made a lot of noise, and then it seems to have fallen off the agenda. Why? Well, in part because we've had such institutional stagnation because of the undermining of those institutions. So, you know, these things are interconnected. But so we see this as an opportunity essentially for the public more broadly to continue these kinds of conversations that have a longer narrative about state capture and corruption in South Africa. And challenging networks at sort of every part and identifying those actors who have been complicit across time. I told you I would be better. I told you I'd be better in terms of ending on time. So I think I've told you a little bit about now about open secrets, and we've discussed some of the continuities. I'd like to now open it up to questions or points or comments and discussions. They can relate to any of the days, I think, we could do that we've discussed from Monday through to Wednesday. Okay, there's a whole range. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's take those 4 and then I'll open it up again. And yeah, should we start? Go in the V. So.
Michael, one of the things that I think has been quite successful in class action, take the asbestos cases, the Tysis cases, very big settlements.
Yeah.
People are thinking, I mean, is that something that has been considered in some of these?
It's a great question. I'm going to take all 4. Sorry, I'm just realizing that I should probably write something down as we go along. So class actions.
Class actions, you know, the asbestos case where, you know, there's a trust that was set up. Tysis, they're about to settle, I think, you know, with the gold company, the mining company.
And the silicosis claim, which has had some recent success. Great. Yes.
Just a question. What I make is that bribery is a very serious crime in most international jurisdictions, and I would have thought there must be a great deal of room for prosecuting international the question I wanted to ask is, you haven't raised any issues in the whitewash of the Seriti arms question. Is that because it's sub judice?
No, actually, we can chat about that a little bit now. And I'm not directly involved in that, so I feel free to speak about it, even though some of the actors involved wouldn't. So that's a very good question. Yes, okay, perfect. And you had a question as well.
Yeah, I was wondering if you think, and if so, if you could detail the role that economic policy plays in either facilitating or restraining economic crime.
And economic policy, you mean sort of broadly the kind of macroeconomic decisions that are made? Okay. Great. And was that, yes?
Firstly, thank you to both of you for wonderfully stimulating presentation.
Thanks.
A friend asked last night, English friend, well, if that's the case, then how
fair question, given that we've spoken about sanctions constantly. Great. So I'll try and tackle these in order. The class actions are something that give us a lot of hope, actually. The South African judiciary has been really quite progressive in that regard, and it's particularly helpful in terms of corporations. The silicosis claims, the asbestos claims, and we're actually working with a fantastic lawyer on some of these issues in Johannesburg. Her name is Zanele Mbuyisa, who worked on the asbestos claims and has an insight into that world. There are, of course, unique challenges that come with this. The one is that apartheid era victims, what is the class, right? It's potentially vast. If you start looking at particular violations in terms of violence, that can then become quite tricky to draw it to particular weapons shipments. And so those are some of the questions that we are kind of thinking about. But it's high up on our list of considerations, and we think that some of the jurisprudence is helpful in that regard. And that would be the first prize, because that would be how you go about restitution, right? That is the best possible way. I think from lawyers who have worked in these spaces before, there are some causes for concern, or not concern, caution. The one is managing expectations. And I think it's something that, us at Open Secrets, we're a tiny organization who predominantly did research. And we definitely don't want to go anywhere and say we can get you money, because that's a promise you can't keep, and that's then unfair. But the second one is just to note, maybe not relevant for us, but of course, there were organizations who took the fight to some of these institutions. An organization like the Kulumani Support Group tried to engage in litigation in the United States around at the beginning, both Swiss companies and then US institutions that aided and abetted apartheid, IBM, Ford, big corporates like that. And what was so tragic about their experience is that Thabo Mbeki undercut them. Mbeki essentially said publicly, South Africa does not support these claims. And then you've got that's powerful, because you've got a liberation fighter, now head of state of a democratic South Africa, saying, no, we're not interested. Let's just let it all go. And it's such an indictment, I think, that the current administration didn't help, or the post-apartheid administrations did not do more to assist a group like Kulumani in demanding accountability. And in fact, they did the opposite. They made it so impossible for them to do so. The hope is that, and this is looking at other countries around the world, is that sometimes time can actually make it a little bit easier to do these things, a little bit of distance. Argentina is an interesting example. Argentina is only now actually holding some of its corporations responsible for their role in disappearances during the military junta. And it just required the political time for things to become a little less sensitive for them to be able to move on that. And they've also been excellent in Argentina at using quite creative forms of law. So they have used the labor law in Argentina to hold corporations accountable who would hand over people to the junta for breaking labor law by not protecting their employees. It's a roundabout way, but if it's the way that you can hold someone accountable, it's great. So, in a roundabout way to say, yes, we're considering as many of those options, and we're hoping that some of that class action precedent will be helpful for us. Yes, so to go to those two questions or 2 points, the bribery under international law, absolutely. Particularly around the contemporary material. Things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States and some of the domestic British legislation around bribery are going to be very, very helpful. I think that some of the problem comes in, particularly with our material, is that depending on which international law expert you speak to, the 1970s and 1980s were a period of great flux in terms of the ability of the law to catch up with the financial sector. So for us, what's interesting is that KBL is able to do what it's able to do because it's really the first time that we're entering into the electronic movement of money. And so no one from Arms Corps needs to go out with a briefcase because they can send money. And so legislation and like proper domestic regulation of those things lagged a little bit. And in terms of the law, and I'm not a lawyer, and my colleague in the room is, so I don't want to like go too far into that territory and lie completely. But it makes it very tricky for us to deal with some of this conduct, particularly if the conduct occurred in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which is why we have tried to go to the slightly broader crimes of the crime of apartheid. One of the questions we are still looking at, though, is, and this goes to your sort of European regulation, is whether the bank's conduct was quite clearly contrary to accepted best practice of the time, which I think that we could argue that it was, and that therefore they violated potentially certain requirements of the countries, or the OECD in particular, about what a multinational corporation needs to do. That would be the basis for our complaint in Europe if we do go to the OECD. To move on to your second point, the Security Commission is, I think, a quintessential example of how one can utilize a body that is enabled by the law and the Constitution in order to put something to rest or to sleep. I think even though, and maybe to provide a little bit of context for those who don't know, the Right to Know campaign and Corruption Watch has currently taken the Security Commission under review in the North Gauteng High Court. And they're asking that the Commission report essentially be set aside on the basis that the Commission just didn't do its job properly. So they're not challenging, they're not rehashing the arguments about corruption. Their argument is that the Security Commission just did not do its job. There's a couple of examples of how the Commission managed to basically strong-arm witnesses out the door. The one is that they just denied them material. So there is a story that the arms deal documentation at one point was stored in these massive storage containers outside of Pretoria. But when the witnesses who were due to testify asked for that material, people like Andrew Feinstein, Paul Holden, even I believe Patricia DeLille, who was one of the people who originally leaked some of that information, they were just not given the documents. So they were not enabled really to prepare properly. In addition to that, one of the most damning examples of the conduct of the Commission is that Sariti, as judge, when witnesses were called and asked to speak, they would say, so there's this document, it's an internal compliance report commissioned, and it says that there was extensive evidence of bribery and payments in order to facilitate deals. Sariti would say, did you author that document? The witnesses, no. Of course I didn't author the document. Okay, then you can't speak to it. And so what the decision of the Commission was, is that if you did not author the document or were not directly involved in that document in some way, you couldn't speak to it. What does that mean? It means only the corrupt can come and provide evidence of their corruption, right? Because if you're identified in a document in terms of receiving a payment, and someone has found that document, well, they're not allowed to speak to it. It's patently absurd. For a commission of inquiry that is given actually quite extensive powers in order to winkle out the truth, for them to make that decision is patently ridiculous. And I think just maybe finally to add on that, the widespread desertion of the Commission of Inquiry by evidence leaders and other senior officials who complained about the conduct. And at least 2 of those officials have said publicly since that they were aware of what they call a second agenda in the Security Commission, which was the direction to them was to discredit the witnesses and downplay evidence. And if you put all of those things together, what you have is you have the evidence that that commission was set up to whitewash the arms deal. Just an interesting point, just to pick up on that, it makes it very difficult for people like Open Secrets in the space Because people always ask us, do you want a commission of inquiry into apartheid-era corruption or state? I'm like, yes and no, because it often, the commission of inquiry comes up as an attractive option when other formal routes are not being adhered to. But the difficulty is we are so aware of their ability to be whitewashed. Also, I keep saying final point. This is the final point on this issue. Where does the whole idea of using commissions of inquiry to whitewash evidence come from? Well, it's the oldest apartheid trick in the book. The apartheid regime used them extensively in order to kill evidence of anything that they didn't want to find. An example of this, just to go back to the archival documents that we found, following the, and I'm not going to forget the name, so forgive me, but following the famous information scandal in the late 1970s, the scandal that facilitated the rise of P.W. Botha to office. P.W. Botha did what any good incoming president would, or then prime minister would do. He implemented a commission of inquiry into what happened into the information scandal. The first judge essentially told P.W. Botha, I'm going to look at everything, and I'm really going to chase this up. He didn't last, I don't think, 6 months. He was fired almost instantly. Unsurprising, because P.W. Botha would have signed off on the special defense account, which is where some of the money from the information scandal came from. If you want a slightly fuller analysis of this, we make the argument in the book that the information scandal essentially is a very carefully calculated political ploy to allow for the rise of P.W. Botha and the Cape NP. There's a lot of interesting evidence for that in the way that it's leaked. He then replaces him with a judge who we've found in P.W. Botha's archive to have been writing regularly to Botha at the time, commending him on his excellent leadership of South Africa, thanking him for his appointment as head of the commission, and ensuring them that he's going to do a good job. It's a quintessential whitewash. And what does that commission of inquiry find? Surprise, surprise, and these are almost the exact words, I can find no evidence of any responsibility whatsoever of P.W. Botha in this deal. I mean, he goes out of his way to carve out a space to say, there was some stuff, but definitely not Botha. And so, and that's one example, but the apartheid state did it regularly. And it's this kind of continuity in practice is just one more example of how, you know, these kinds of politics play out, I guess, over and over again. So then the last two questions, the role of economic policy. Not an economic expert, but I think what I would say is that the move, or the strong move to privatize, particularly the provision of services, it allows for a lot of space for these kinds of activities to happen. And I think that SASSA is a classic example of that, right? The minute you take a state's fundamental responsibility, providing social grants to 17 million people, and social grants is a perfect example, a really apt example, because, I mean, the social grant system in South Africa is the band-aid on potentially a powder keg. The only way that the kind of wealth inequality in South Africa is supportable is because social grants provide a minimum to so many people to allow them to survive. But the reason that was so easily manipulated is that the state was just given the task, or the minister was given a task, just find a company to do it, right? It just so happened that company had 6 or 7 subsidiaries who just saw an absolute chance to make a mint of it, right? And what I think it does, and again, others could speak much better to this, and in fact, my colleague Koresha has worked on this case at her previous job, so you could speak to her on this specific case. But what it does is it starts to bleed away responsibility, right? No one quite knows. Also, someone like Batabilet Lamini is now seeking to avoid responsibility, even though that she's the minister in charge of social grants, right? And I think